The other day I put out a video titled The Operating System Known as Linux. In that video I discussed what it means for something to be called Linux. What is the Linux kernel? What is a Linux distro? What we mean when we say the Linux operating system. Now, this video is a direct follow-up to that one, so be sure to go check that out if you've not seen it yet. There is one thing I explicitly left out in that video, which people in the comment section very quickly pointed out. A bunch of them very quickly pointed out. I didn't mention something known as GNU, a recursive acronym, GNU's not Unix, the same spelling as the other name for a wildebeest, GNU, which some people also use as the name instead of GNU. GNU and GNU, those are the same thing, but what is that? I intentionally didn't include GNU in that video because, frankly, there is just as much to talk about when it comes to GNU as there is Linux by itself. So you may recall in the earliest days of Linux, there was only the Linux kernel, the project created by Linus Torvalds. There was no Linux distros yet. This idea of a Linux operating system, that wasn't a thing. There was the Linux kernel, and then some people might have made use of it through various means. Now, when distros came along, they were a collection of software alongside the kernel to make an operating system. A desktop, a browser, all of these very useful tools. But one of those very often included suites, so often in fact that basically every Linux distro that you can think of is going to have it by default, is the GNU Core Util suite. So in the terminal of any Linux system, you're going to have commands like ls to list files, rm to remove a file, touch to make a file, cat to print a file, and a bunch of other commands that you can guarantee are going to be on your system. These could all be handled individually, and if you feel like doing so, you can replace them. You have the power to do so. It is Linux. But in most cases, and out of the box, the versions you're going to see are the GNU versions of these tools. Now, saying versions implies there are others out there. Well, the GNU Core Utils are not the first, and were never originally made for Linux in the first place. Whilst there are Linux-based operating systems like Android and Chrome OS, and this is true, this isn't the entire story, because Linux is also based on an even older tradition known as Unix. It is a Unix-like operating system, so through the law of transitivity, Android and Chrome OS are also Unix-like as well. Nobody cares which way you refer it to as, so if you want to call them Unix-like or Linux-like, either way works. But Linux itself, that is based on Unix, that is Unix-like. It is not a fork of Unix, it is not using Unix code, because most of the legacy Unix systems, they were made by big companies, they were proprietary. So Unix first commercially released in the 1970s, with variants like BSD, which you still see today with things like FreeBSD, OpenBSD, NetBSD, those are open source, but a lot of the others like Xenix from Microsoft, SunOS and Solaris from Sun Microsystems, HPUX from HP, AIX from IBM, and many others, those were proprietary, they were only commercially available. Without this becoming a history video on Unix, which deserves a whole video unto itself, the important thing here is a lot of these tools like ls, like rm, like touch, like these core GNU util tools that we have on Linux systems today, they come from this Unix operating system landscape. This is where they were first being created. Not every single one of them, there have been additions over the years, but those core foundational tools, most of them can be traced back to the 1970s. Over the years, there have been further additions and further remakes, with GNU just being the most commonly used one on Linux. So, originally the core utils were not the core utils. They were actually separate, related efforts. You had the file utils for dealing with files, the shell utils for dealing with your shell, and the text utils for dealing with text. But in the early 2000s, all of them got merged into the singular core utils project because, Frankly, everybody was installing them all anyway, and they were all effectively part of that like core set of utilities, so calling them separate things didn't really make much sense. You will still sometimes see them referred to as separate things when people are talking about the groupings of the tools, but technically the separation doesn't exist anymore. Now, file utils were the first releasing. They came out in 1990, but keep in mind, Linux didn't actually get released until August of 1991. So, who were they being made for then? Well, have you ever seen the email where Linus Torvalds announced Linux? Hello everybody out there using Minix. Minix is another Unix-like operating system. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU for 386, 486 AT clones. The important part here is big and professional like GNU. That implies that GNU was already very well established by this point in 1991. So the GNU project, which sounds similar to the GNU core utils, for an obvious reason, was first announced in 1983 by a man known as Richard Stallman. The goal was, and still is, to give computer users the freedom to control and use their own computer, which might sound crazy today, right? Like, how is it that people couldn't control and use their own computer in 1983? Look at all of the AI and all of this Windows stuff and all this crazy stuff going on today. Well, whilst it might be worse now, that doesn't mean that the sort of budding of a problem wasn't first starting to form with the introduction of the home computer, where all of the major operating systems at the time were proprietary. All of the software you were running was proprietary. You couldn't see the code. You couldn't go and modify the code. You were really locked down to what these companies wanted you to do. Now, to solve this problem, we saw the beginning of tools to make something better happen. A text editor, Emacs, the bash shell for use in your terminal, that thing that will actually run commands like ls, rm, touch, so on and so forth, GCC to compile a C code, and a series of other tools, most of which are still used in Linux today. Most people don't use Emacs as their text editor, but bash and GCC absolutely are still in incredibly heavy use. And all of this work was done to take on the biggest endeavor yet, to create a new operating system known as GNU Hurd. The GNU core utils were also being created for use on GNU Hurd. GNU Hurd is another Unix-like operating system. After a series of restarts and road bumps with development meant to have begun in 1986, the current effort didn't seriously begin until 1990. And then a very short year later, Linus Torvalds announced the Linux kernel. And whilst he wasn't intending to make this a serious project, it was originally being done so he could learn how the CPU he had worked. People didn't care. They liked the work he was doing, they liked what Linux was, and very quickly, it drew a lot of attention, and very quickly, attention was drawn away from Hurd, which had years of failures and delays, and people wanted to see something where it looked like it was actually progressing. So very quickly, the Linux kernel overtook the effort of the work being done on the GNU Hurd kernel, and instead of fighting it, they kept development of Hurd going, and that's still something being done today. It's not a major project, but there are versions of Debian, for example, that do make use of the GNU Hurd kernel, but instead of just doing that, GNU began cooperating with Linux, as it was most of what GNU was looking for with what they were doing on GNU Hurd. One of those major similarities was how the code was being licensed. What were the terms of how this open source code could be used? Now, originally it had a custom license, which had weird things like you can't use this in a commercial context and other weird terms which could very easily be overturned by a lawyer because it was just written by Linus. He just didn't really care. Again, it was a hobby project initially. But very quickly, he moved the project over to another license known as the GNU GPL v2, the GNU General Public License version 2. This is the same GNU as we mentioned earlier. Another endeavor that Richard Storm was involved in was the creation of something known as the Free Software Foundation. Free as in freedom, not free as in beer. Yes, I know this sounds stupid. Everyone thinks it sounds stupid, but it's the way it's always been. And the Free Software Foundation, often just referred to as the FSF, is still operating to this day, and one of the core things they outlined is the 4 essential freedoms, the freedoms that software should provide to the user. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. The freedom to redistribute copies so you can help others, and the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. By doing this, you can give the whole community a chance to benefit from your changes. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. And the way that this was accomplished was through something known as the free software movement, which is counter to the open source movement. Now, a lot of people like to pit these two movements against each other, but for most people out there, the differences are fairly minor. Unless you're dealing with corporate-controlled software, in a lot of cases, they can kind of be treated as mostly the same thing. And a lot of people use the term free and open source. Again, free as in freedom, not free as in beer. There are better terms than free, like Libre, for example, and sometimes that term is used instead. But the free term has kind of stuck, which leads people down this route of confusion where they think free means I don't have to pay for it. Again, freedom, not free as in beer, not free as in price. I keep saying free as in beer because this is specifically a phrase used by the FSF. Now, to allow people to build software that is always going to preserve these freedoms, the FSF went and created a series of licenses. The GNU GPL licenses, the GNU General Public Licenses, and the various versions made after the fact. V2, V3, and whatever may come in the future. These are even used outside of the world of Linux. They're not the most prevalent licenses nowadays. I think that goes to maybe the MIT license, maybe some form of the BSD license, but it's always a very common license choice to go with. However, it's especially prevalent when we are talking about Linux, because if all of our core software, like the GNU core utils, are using this license, if Linux itself is using this license, well, things built on top of that, well, they can also use the license. In some cases, they kind of have to because of license incompatibilities. But even in cases where they don't have to, people still choose to use this license as everything else around them is also using the license. It's a lot easier to build something that tries to protect user freedom when everybody else is trying to do the same thing. Now, fully speaking on the GPL and other licenses like it, that itself would be a whole nother video that is a massive side tangent that we'll leave for today. Now, circling all the way back to the start, in that prior video, some people got very annoyed by me not mentioning GNU. And I think the main reason for that is there is a lot of importance placed on GNU, on the FSF, and on the GNU core utils for the early success of Linux. So much so, in fact, that there is a group of people that think that GNU should be part of the name for Linux. So, if we go way, way back to the early days of Linux, there was an early distro known as Yggdrasil Linux. But in that name, it also sometimes went by Yggdrasil Linux /GNU/X. X is for another video. The GNU part here is important. There were early discussions that floated around that the name of the operating system should be gnu+linux or gnu+linux. You have the Linux kernel, you take the GNU core utils, you add them together, gnu/linux or gnu+linux. Even Debian, the second oldest still running Linux distro for a time, went by Debian GNU/Linux. In those early days, back in the early 90s, it became really, really common to argue about the name of Linux. Is it Linux or is it GNU/Linux? What do we call the operating system? Originally, Richard Stallman had been leaning towards a different name though. Lignux, pronounced, as you can probably guess, as Lignux, or Lignuix, or I don't know how you would say this, and a lot of other people felt the same way, and there were a lot of complaints about that name, so Stallman started backing the GNU/Linux name as well. And for years since then, Stallman, the GNU project, and the FSF, and then people that support these endeavors have sort of campaigned for the Linux operating system to instead be called GNU/Linux. You have the kernel, the Linux kernel, call that the Linux kernel if you want to. But when we're talking about this as an operating system, you should put respect on the GNU name and have it as part of the name for the operating system. And I think a big part of that also comes from the fact that Linux kind of took the steam away from GNU Herd, and GNU was going to be in the name for that operating system. So especially in those early days, it kind of felt like Linux was taking something away from GNU by being the thing that everybody was gravitating towards. This was the free software operating system. This was the free software kernel. Even though GNU had started it years earlier, they didn't really get to the point where it was ready before Linux came along. This idea of calling gnu+linux is so popular, in fact, that even if you're not involved in Linux, you've probably heard the GNU copypasta. I'd like to interject for a moment. What you're referring to as Linux is in fact GNU/Linux, or as I've taken to calling it, GNU+Linux. Linux is not an operating system unto itself, but rather another free component of a fully functioning GNU system made useful by the GNU core libs, shell utilities, and vital system components comprising a full OS as defined by POSIX, and it just keeps going on from there. There was a very long period that people really cared about this name. In recent years, however, especially as distros kind of took the name GNU out of their own name, it's kind of fallen quite a bit out of favor, and you'll still run into people who say the name is GNU+Linux, but it's not something which most Linux users really care about. As you can tell, I'm not one of the people that care to call it GNU+Linux. Now, there have always been other versions of the core utils besides the GNU core utils. Technically, they are only called core utils when talking about the GNU version, because that's technically a GNU-ish sort of name, but people use it colloquially anyway, and there wasn't really a good term before that, so calling them all core utils works well enough. Obviously, you have those old Unix implementations, but common in the embedded and commercial applications, you would often see something known as the BusyBox utils. They aren't one-to-one compatible with GNU, as GNU makes a lot of extensions to these tools, adds some different features, fixes different bugs, but it's the same set of tools. In more recent years, there's actually been an effort to shift away from GNU's versions on regular distros like Ubuntu. This is thanks to an effort known as utils. This is a Rust rewrite of the GNU core utils, and this is aiming to be a direct replacement for these. They still need quite a bit of work. There is still a lot of stuff missing. There is still a lot of inconsistencies, and I believe some tools are just straight up missing, but it will likely be present in some form in the next major release of Ubuntu 25.10. So there you go. To everybody who didn't like the fact that I didn't mention GNU in that previous video, here you go. And I'm sure there's going to be some random thing that I could have included here that I didn't include. So be sure to spam my comment section with other things that I should have included, and I don't know, maybe I'll make a video on those as well. I'm always looking for new things to look into. Anyway, if you liked the video, you learned something, go like the video. Even people who are fairly experienced with Linux may have learned something here about the history of GNU. Anyway, if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and GNU.
What is